Basic medical sciences, welcome. In this video, we are going to talk about the functional classification of joints, right? So in the previous videos, we talked about synarthrosis, where we talked about the syndesmosis, synchondrosis, synostosis, right? We talked about everything here, permanent temporary synchondrosis, kyphosis, ligaments, membranes. So you can click the link on the top right corner and watch that video first. And we also talked about the hemiarthrosis, and we had an introduction in the synovial joints, right? So in this video, we're going to be focusing on this part, right? So the joints are classified into three groups according to the range of motion, right? So we have uniaxial joints, biaxial joints, and multiaxial joints, right? Uniaxial joints allow motion in one plane or one axis. Biaxial joints allow motion in two axes or two planes. And multiaxial joints allow motion in three or more planes or three or more axes, right? Under uniaxial joints, we have trochoid joints, also known as pivot joints, hinge joint, and screw joints. Under biaxial joints, we have ellipsoid joints, condyloid joints, saddle joints. Under multiaxial, we have spheroid joints, ball and socket joints, and plane joints. Right. So let's start with the trochoid joint. Right. It's under uniaxial joint. Right. So trochoid joints, also known as the pivot joint. This is a cylindrical or wheel-like articular surface whose axis is a vertical line running parallel to the long axis of the articulating bones or to the vertical body axis, and this joint permits movement in one vertical axis, right? That is rotation. And if you remember, inward rotation is called pronation. Outward rotation is called supination. All right, so this is just a model, an example. So you can see the kind of movement is rotation, right? So we have two examples here, atlantoaxial joint and proximal radial ulnar joint, right? So this we need to discuss more about this trochoid joint because there are two kinds, right? So in the first type, the bone pivot rotates within a ring formed by the articular fossa and a ring of ligament. For example, the proximal radial ulnar joint, in which the radius rotates inwards, thus pronation, and outwards, thus supination, right? So you can see here supination, right? You see the palmar surface. In pronation, you see the dorsal surface. Supination again, right? So the other thing I told you in the previous video, right? In pronation, you will see it like this. The radius will be crossing the ulna here. But in supination, they are parallel, right? That is the first kind of trochoid joint. The second one, the ring formed by the ligament and articular fossa rotates on a bone pivot, right? So in this case, this bone pivot is fixed. This the fossa, the articular fossa, and the ring ligament is rotating, right? It's rotating, but this place, this bone pivot is fixed, right? So example, the articulation between the atlas and the axis, right? That's the atlantoaxial joint. And in this joint, the ring of atlas rotates to the right and to the left about the dens of the axial vertebrae, right? That's what I just explained, right? But I just want to make sure you understand this concept, right? In the first type, I said the bone pivot rotates within, right? This is in the first type, it rotates within the articular fossa and a ring of ligament. But in this second type, It's not rotating, it's fixed. What is rotating is the actual ligament and the articular force. They are rotating about this pivot, right? Okay. The next joint is the hinge joint or ganglimus, right? So in this case, the articular surface is a cylinder stretching transversely, while the long axis is a transverse line running to the frontal plane perpendicular to the long axis of the articulating bones. And as a result, the movements at the hinge joint are made on this frontal axis, thus flexion and extension, right? A guiding groove and crest on the articulating surfaces prevent the lateral slipping and facilitate the movement on a single axis, right? So you can see it here in the humeral-ulnar joint, right? It's also found like interphalangeal joints, and this movement is also found in the knee joint, ankle joint, and elbow joint. Elbow joint here, but particularly the humeral-ulnar joint, right? Okay. Then the next one is the screw joint. This screw joint is actually like its movements are actually similar to the true hinge joint, right? So the guiding groove of the hinge is not perpendicular to the axis but forms a certain angle with it. Then a screw-like line can be drawn on the extension of the groove, right? So I told you the movements are same as the ones in true hinge joint, right? So you can see here, this I'm sure it should be humeral radial here, humeral radial, not humeral ulnar, right? That's where the screw-like shape is formed, right? But please make sure you clarify with your manual here, right? I want to make sure you understand this concept, right? Biaxial joints, right? And in biaxial joints, the first one is the ellipsoid joint, articulatio ellipsoidea. The articulating surfaces are segments of an ellipse or ellipse, right? One of them is convex, oval, and unequally curved in two directions. The other articular surface is correspondingly concave. These kind of joints allow movements on two horizontal axes which are perpendicular to each other, right? So these are the movements, right? In the frontal axis, thus flexion and extension. On the sagittal axis, thus abduction and adduction. Ligaments in ellipsoid joints are perpendicular to the pivotal axis and are at the same ends of pivotal axis. This is an ellipsoid joint, right? You find it in the radiocarpal joints, metatarsophalangeal joints from 2 to 5, metatarsophalangeal joint, right? So you can see the ellipse here. Okay. The next one is the condyloid or bicondyloid joint, articulatio condylaris or articulatio bicondylaris, right? So in this case, a condyloid joint has a convex articular head in the form of a protruding rounded process which resembles an ellipse in shape and is called a condyle, right? So we'll talk about the bones of the lower limb, but just for now, you see there is on the femur, on the distal end, there is these two condyles, the lateral femoral condyle and the medial one, right? So these two articulates with the tibia, and on the tibia you find a depression on the articular surface, right? And it corresponds to the condyle. The condyloid joint may be regarded as a variety of ellipsoid articulation, a transient from a hinge to ellipsoid joint. The frontal axis is therefore its principal pivotal axis, right? So at this joint, the principal movement is flexion and extension, right? A condyloid joint differs from the hinge joint in size and shape of the articulating surfaces. As a result, in distinction from the hinge joint, the condyloid joint allows movements in two axes. On the frontal axis, that's what I told you, flexion and extension, and on the vertical axis, rotation. It differs from an ellipsoid joint in the number of articular hairs. The condyloid joint always have two condyles located more or less sagittally, and there are two scenarios. In the first case, these joints are enclosed in one capsule, right? For example, the knee joint, and in another scenario, two separate capsules, like the atlanto-occipital joints. Right, so here is just a zoomed view of the knee joint, right, showing the medial and lateral femoral condyles, right. So in this case, it's in one capsule, right. This condyloid joint is in one capsule, and another one is the atlanto-occipital joint, but two separate capsules, right. This one is left and right. Okay, so this is the atlanto-occipital joint. And the last type is the saddle joint. I mean, the last in biaxial joint, right? So saddle, just to remember a saddle on the horse, right? Okay, you will see this shape is spectacular. All right. So this joint is formed by two saddle-shaped articulating surfaces, and one astride the other, moving lengthwise and across the other. As a result, the joint allows movement in two mutually perpendicular axes, that's on frontal axis, flexion and extension, and sagittal axis, abduction and adduction. A very good example is the carpal metacarpal joint of the thumb, right? The first one. That's the other name. Thumb is the first, right? So you can see, right? So it can go like to this side or towards you this side, and it can go to the front or to the back, right? So that's so those movements at the thumb, you can try these movements: abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, right? So the saddle joint on the thumb, first metacarpal joint. Okay, right. Next, we'll talk about the multi-axial joints, right? And the first one is the ball and socket joint, articulatio spheroidea, right? Articulatio spheroidea. So in this case, one of the articular surfaces form a convex spherical head, and the other will form a concave articular cavity, right? The movement can occur in the following three axes. On the frontal axis, extension and flexion. On the sagittal axis, abduction and adduction. In the vertical axis, rotation. It can be inward, that's pronation, and outwards, that's supination. There can be also a movement across from one axis to the other, right? So this one is called circumduction, from one axis to another, right? A very good example of a ball and socket joint is the shoulder joint, right? Okay. The ball and socket joint is the most freely mobile joint, since the range of movement depends on the difference in the extent of the articular surfaces. The articular fossa in such joint is small, and is small in comparison to the head, right? There's something I wanted to mention right now, but don't worry, I will tell you later. Typical ball and socket joints have only a few accessory ligaments, which determines their freedom of movement. So you can see here the shoulder joint, right? So okay, right, we are back. The shoulder joint, so they can be flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and circumduction. You can see the model here, right? That's the shoulder joint. The hip joint is a special kind of ball and socket joint, right? It's a special kind. So it's actually classified as a separate, called a what? A cotyloid joint. Why? It's the only difference is about the depth, right? So let's look at it. The cotyloid joint, right? So I said it's a variety of the ball and socket articulation. This articular fossa is deep and it embraces the greater part of the head. Unlike in the shoulder joint, right? It's not deep, it's very shallow. Therefore, a wide range of movements in the shoulder joint compared to the hip, right? So a hip joint is an example of the cotyloid joint. As a result, movement is more restricted at this joint than a typical ball and socket joint. This construction lends greater stability to the joint, right? So here is the hip joint. So you can see the articular fossa. It is a special name called acetabulum, right? Acetabulum of the hip joint or acetabular fossa. And this is the head of the femur. It gets in, right? Okay. The next kind is called the plane joint, right? Plane joint or articulatio plana, right? The articular surfaces in these joints are almost flat. They can be regarded as the surfaces of a sphere with a very large radius. They consequently allow movement in all three axes, but the range of movement is small because the articular surfaces differ only slightly. The ligaments are arranged on all sides of the plane joint. A very good example of the plane joint is the intervertebral joint. All right, so this is an example. In addition to intervertebral joints, there is acromioclavicular joint, sternoclavicular joint, which is here, right, between the sternum and a clavicle. Right, so gliding, same as plane joint. Vertebral costal joints, sacroiliac joint, right? But sacroiliac joint is one of a kind, is special. This one is actually regarded to as an amphiarthrosis, right? Why? Because of limited movement. This group of articulation, the amphiarthrosis, which differ in the shape of the articular surface but are similar in some other joint features. They have a short, tightly stretched articular capsule, very strong auxiliary apparatus, particularly short reinforcing ligaments which cannot be stretched. As a result, the articulating surfaces are in closed contact, which limits the movements sharply. Amphiarthrosis permit only very slight gliding movement, and this will reduce the jolts and shocks between the bones, right? So here is your sacroiliac joint, right? So between the this one is the sacrum and the ilium, sacroiliac joint here and here, right? It only allow small range of movement. So again, this is our classification. So we finished all of them, right? Synarthrosis, these ones are uninterrupted. Hemiarthrosis, interrupted a little bit, like pubic symphysis. And diarthrosis, these are interrupted. Synarthrosis, uninterrupted, and diarthrosis, interrupted, or true joints, or synovial joints. Hemiarthrosis are just a transition, right? So please make sure you watch the previous video. We talked about the first part, like synarthrosis, all of them. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you find it very useful, if you find that the videos we are making here are useful to you, you can subscribe. It's free of charge so that you won't miss any of our latest videos. Until next time.